He could have any woman in the territory. He chose to guard one who was terrified. There was a lantern on the post outside the Dellard livery the night she arrived, and I remember the way it swung in the wind, slow, like it couldn't make up its mind, throwing this orange wash across the mud and then pulling it back again. I was leaning on the rail of the porch across the way, finishing a smoke, and I wasn't looking for anything. I hadn't been looking for anything in a long time. The stage came in late, 20 minutes past dark when it should have been in by mid-afternoon, and the driver's face when he climbed down told you the road had been unkind. 4 passengers. A drummer in a brown coat who stepped out first and immediately started complaining to no one in particular. Something about axles, something about the company. A preacher who'd sweated through his collar and looked like he'd been reconsidering his vocation somewhere around mile 40. A boy of maybe 12 who dropped straight to the ground and started turning in a slow circle, taking it all in the way kids do when they've never seen a real town before, even a small one. And then her. She came out last. Had to duck a little, the door frame was low, and when she straightened up she stood still for a full 3 seconds before she moved again, not looking at anything in particular. Just stopped, the way an animal stops when it steps into a clearing and hasn't decided yet whether to run. She had a carpet bag in one hand and a smaller case in the other, the kind women used for sewing things. Dark hair that come partly loose from whatever she'd pinned it with. Dress that had been good once, maybe 6 months ago, maybe a year, and had been kept careful since. She was holding herself careful too, the way you do when something hurts and you've learned to hide it from people you don't know. I noticed that without meaning to. Nothing I should have noticed more than that. Wasn't my business. I finished the smoke, dropped it in the mud, went to check on my horse. I need to tell you something about Dellard, because you can't understand any of the rest of this without knowing what kind of place it was. It was a supply town. Not large and not trying to be large. It existed because ranchers came in from 40 miles in any direction to buy flour and wire and nails, to get drunk in one of 2 saloons, to send letters back east that might or might not arrive, to pick up what the stage brought and ship out what they had. It had a main street of maybe a quarter mile, the livery at one end, the marshal's office at the other, and everything that mattered in between. The Caldwell Hotel, which was decent enough if you didn't look too hard at the ceiling and didn't have strong feelings about the mattress. Fisher's General Store, run by a German named Hans Fischer whose wife made bread on Thursdays and sold it from the back window, and who was, in my estimation, the most genuinely content person I'd ever met. A barbershop, a church that only had a preacher every 3rd Sunday and sat empty and useful the rest of the time. The Assier's office, which was mostly used now as a place the old men played cards on rainy afternoons. And at the south end, Sorrell's grain merchant, which smelled exactly like what it was and was run by a man of 65 who'd come out from Pennsylvania in some earlier part of his life and had made himself indispensable without anyone quite noticing when it had happened. It was the kind of town where everybody knew what everybody else was doing by noon of the same day. If you sneezed on the east end of the street, old Martha Pell was already making soup for you on the west end before you'd found your handkerchief. That sounds warm. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was the kind of warmth that's indistinguishable from strangling. I've been coming to Dellard for 12 years. Had a spread about 8 miles southeast, not large, not small, the kind of operation that works if you work it hard and fall apart if you let it drift. Ran some cattle, some horses, kept it together with myself, and 2 hands named Crew and Paulo. Crew was 60-something and had been with me since I bought the place, a man of very few words and enormous practical competence who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim. Paulo was 23 and thought he knew more than he did, but was learning fast in the way young men learn fast when they're working alongside someone who won't let things slide. I wasn't what you'd call a fixture in town, but I wasn't a stranger either. People knew my name, knew what I was about. That has value in a territory where trust is a thing you build slow and can lose in an afternoon. And I'll tell you the other thing straight, because it becomes part of the story and I'd rather put it down plainly than have you piece it together sideways. Women in Dellard were not indifferent to me. I'm not saying this to brag, I'm saying it because it's going to be relevant and I want you to understand it before we get there. I was 41 that fall, lean, and I'd kept my health. Owned land free and clear and had the papers in good order. Hadn't developed any notable vices, at least not the expensive kind. Nell Fisher, Fisher's wife, used to say I was the best-looking man in the county who didn't know it, which she'd say loud enough that Fisher could hear, and Fisher would roll his eyes and go back to his inventory without a word, because he'd been married long enough to understand that some things aren't a threat, they're just the weather. I'd had 2 women come close to something real. One I'd courted wrong, too much in my head, not enough in the room with her, and she'd married a man in Santa Fe who knew how to be present in a room. The other I'd courted right, or right enough, but she got sick the winter of '83 and was gone by March, and that was a thing that took a long time to learn to carry. After the second one, I stopped looking. Not out of grief alone, though grief was in it. More out of a feeling that I'd had my shots at the particular thing and I'd used them, and the next phase of life was keeping the ranch going and not expecting any more than that. I was reasonably at peace with it by the fall I'm talking about, or I had myself convinced I was, which amounts to the same thing until it doesn't. I'll tell you what the years between were like, because they matter. I worked. That's the honest answer. The ranch took everything I gave it and asked for more, which was what I'd wanted when I bought it, something that demanded the whole of you so you weren't left over at the end of the day to sit with whatever you were sitting with. Crew and I added a proper barn the 3rd year and a bunkhouse the 5th. I bought adjacent grazing rights from an old rancher named Pickett who was done with it and went to live with his son in Colorado. Built the fence lines out to the new boundary. Got the cattle numbers up to where they made sense. People in the territory knew me as a man who was reliable and who paid what he owed and who didn't make trouble and didn't back down from it if it came to him. That kind of reputation builds slow and holds. I was invited to things, dinners at the big ranches to the north, the stockmen's meeting in Aurelio twice a year, and I went when it was useful and declined when it wasn't, and that was fine. Women in Dellard and beyond, as I said, had their own opinions about me. I was polite to all of them. I wasn't cold. After a while, I'd made a kind of peace with the idea that the chance for that particular thing had passed, and politeness was the right register for that kind of peace. One evening in the summer before the fall I'm telling you about, Nell Fisher had said to me, in her direct way, "You're going to die alone at that ranch if you don't stop acting like it's already over." Nell, Fisher had said from behind his counter. "He knows I'm right," she'd said. I'd said something polite and non-committal and gotten back to my wagon, but I'd thought about it on the drive home, about whether she was right, about whether what I'd been calling peace was peace or whether it was just the word I'd found for giving up. I hadn't found a good answer by the time fall came. That's where I was the night the stage came in. Her name, I learned the next morning, was Ida Voss. Not from her. From Fisher, who had it from his wife, who had it from the hotel register, which she'd read over Caldwell's shoulder while ostensibly inquiring about the price of lard, which she had no interest in. Her name was Ida Voss. She'd come from somewhere east, maybe Kansas, maybe further east than that. The signature was unclear on the Kansas end, and she'd paid for 1 week in advance in cash, which Fisher's wife had noted as suspicious because who pays a full week in cash in a place they've never been unless they're planning to stay put and don't want to have to think about it again? She was a seamstress, apparently, had brought her tools, had asked about whether there was work of that kind in town. Fisher's wife had told her to come around Monday and they'd see. I didn't seek any of this out. It came to me the way information came to you in Dellard, which is to say it was simply in the air and breathing was enough. What I found out on my own, because I happened to be there, came 3 days after she arrived. I was coming out of the livery on a Wednesday morning, early, the day cool and still in that fall way, and I saw her come out of the hotel across the street. She was heading to Fisher's, from the look of it, walking with purpose. She had a shawl on against the cold. She moved well, unhurried but definite, the walk of a woman who knows where she's going and doesn't need anyone's permission to go there. 2 men stepped off the boardwalk to block her path. I didn't know them. Riders passing through, their horses were tied at the saloon rail, different colored saddles, not matched up with any outfit I recognized. The kind of men who move from territory to territory without putting roots down anywhere, which is sometimes just wanderlust and sometimes something less comfortable than wanderlust. They'd positioned themselves easy enough casual, but it wasn't casual. You learn to read the geometry of these things, how men stand when they mean to make something difficult. I couldn't hear what they said to her. I could see her face. I've seen scared before. I've seen the practical kind, a horse that could kill you, a fire that might jump the brake, a rattler on the path. That kind has a beginning and an end. It passes once the thing is over, and usually you can laugh about it later, or at least stop thinking about it. What was on her face was the other kind. The kind that doesn't have an acute beginning anymore because it's been going on so long it's become a condition. It's in the resting expression, quiet as a bruise that's been there long enough to stop being tender to the touch. She looked at those 2 men the way people look at something they were already expecting, something they'd been dreading and had known, in some part of themselves, was coming. She stepped back, said something to them. One of the men laughed, the shorter of the 2, the one with a red bandana, and the other one moved a step to the side, not threatening, just present, which was the threatening part. I walked across the street. Not fast, not in a heat, just walked, the way you walk when you've decided to go somewhere. I came up alongside her and said, "Morning, Ida," in the same way I'd say good morning to anyone I'd known for years, and I put my hand on the small of her back, very light, just enough to be felt, and looked at the 2 men the way you look at a thing you're trying to decide what to do with. "Something I can do for you boys," I said, same tone I'd use if they'd asked me for directions. They looked at me, looked at each other, looked at me again. I'm not a small man. I've been told my face, when I'm not working at making it agreeable, has a quality that some people find reassuring and some people find discouraging. These 2 found it discouraging. There were also things about the way I was standing that communicated things, and we all knew what they were without anyone saying them. They said something about a misunderstanding, moved back to their horses. Ida didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, without looking at me, "I didn't ask for that." "I know," I said. "You all right." She looked at me then, brown eyes up close, older than the rest of her, those eyes, like they'd seen another 20 years that the rest of her face hadn't gotten to yet. "Why?" she said, not friendly, not unfriendly, just the question. "Why what? Why'd you do that?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have sounded like a speech, so I said the plain thing. "I don't like that kind of thing, men doing that to women." She studied me for another second. Something moved in her face, a small recalibration, like she'd expected a different answer and was deciding what to do with this one. She nodded once, not warm, not cold, just a nod. "Walk to Fisher's." That should have been the end of it. In any other period of my life it probably would have been. I'd have thought, woman in trouble, helped her out, not my business past that, and gone back to my work. But I kept thinking about the way she looked at those men, not the fear of the moment, the underneath fear, the one that lived there. 3 days later, I came in to pick up fence wire from Fisher, and she was at the counter ahead of me. She turned when she heard the door open, turned fast, the way people do when they've been trained to track sudden sounds, and for about half a second before she got her face arranged I saw something. Not quite relief. The beginning of relief, like a door that's almost opened. Then she put her expression back to something more neutral and said nothing. I said nothing either. There was nothing to say that didn't require explanation. I bought my wire. She was finishing up her own purchase: soap, a tin of coffee, 2 candles, a small packet of pins. She stepped aside to let me get to the counter, and I said thank you, and Fisher was already pulling up my account, and there was a silence that wanted filling, so I said, "You settling in all right?" "As well as I need to," she said. Which wasn't quite an answer, and we both knew it. "Fisher's wife makes bread on Thursdays," I said. "It's worth knowing if you're going to be around Thursdays." She looked at me sideways, measuring. "Is that what men talk about, bread schedules? When the bread's worth it?" Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the terrain a smile would occupy, a courtesy toward one. "I'll bear it in mind," she said, and picked up her things and went out. Fisher, without looking up from his ledger, "She's staying on, you think?" "I don't know," I said, which was true. I genuinely didn't know. Fisher made a sound that in 12 years I'd learned could mean almost anything. I want to be honest about what I was doing in those first weeks, or trying to be honest, because I wasn't fully honest with myself about it at the time. I told myself it wasn't anything. A woman had come to town under some kind of shadow, I'd helped her once, and that was the extent of my involvement. I had a ranch to run. We were heading into the back end of fall, and there was honest work to be done. A stretch of fence on the north side that needed one more pass before the cold set in. The well at the north pasture with a slow leak that Crew and I had been telling each other we'd get to for the better part of 2 months. The hay situation that I'd been doing the arithmetic on and not quite liking the results. Work. Plenty of it. I did it. But I came into town, more than usual that month. Not to see her. I didn't tell myself I was coming to see her. I came in because Fisher needed me to pick up a part he'd ordered for the hand pump, and that was true. I came in because I wanted to check in with Troot. The marshal, man named Cal Troot, who'd been here longer than I had and was good at it, about some cattle that gone missing from Yarbra's place east of mine, and I wanted to know if it was an isolated thing or something I should be paying more attention to, and that was also true. I came in because the weather was turning earlier than usual that year, and I wanted to get another supply run done before the road from the east got difficult, and that was true too. All real reasons. But I noticed her each time, whether she came out of Fisher's while I was there, whether she was walking the street, whether she looked the way she'd looked those first few days, that braced quality, or whether something in her was starting to settle. What I was doing, and I can say it plainly now from the other side of all of it, was watching to make sure she was all right, not in a way she'd notice or that I'd have admitted to if someone had pressed me. Just the quiet animal kind of watching. She is here, she is managing, she is upright. That's enough. Go back to work. I told myself that was the whole of it. Mostly, I even believed it. The day things changed between us, or changed in a way that couldn't be walked back, was a Thursday in October. I was in town legitimately. I needed to see Troot about the Yarbra situation, which had grown into something that was starting to look less like strays and more like someone taking them deliberate. Took longer than I'd expected. By the time I was done, it was mid-afternoon, and I swung by Fisher's to pick up a few things I'd been putting off picking up, and Ida was at the counter. She was buying bread. Friday's wife's Thursday bread. So she'd taken that advice, which for reasons I couldn't have justified gave me a small quiet satisfaction. There was a man at the counter with her, which I clocked before I'd taken 2 steps inside. I recognized him. Fellow named Dent, small outfit 12 miles north, ran it on a shoestring and a short temper. Not a bad man in the sense of being criminal. Not a good one in the sense of being decent to people who couldn't do anything for him. The kind of man who's always working an angle, always calculating what he can get from a situation, and who looks at a woman alone and sees a situation. He was talking to her in the loud, familiar way of a man who's decided he has a right to a woman's time before the woman has been consulted on the matter, leaning in too close, asking her questions that were really just a way of hearing himself talk near her. Ida was answering short yes and no, and I suppose the answers of someone who wants the conversation to end and is being polite about wanting it to end, but only barely. I came up to the counter and said, "Fisher, I need to settle up for that pump part you ordered." Fisher produced the ledger without missing a beat. Dent looked at me. I looked at the ledger. "Didn't know you two knew each other," Dent said. I took my time writing my name next to the amount. "I've been coming to Fisher's for 12 years, I said. "I meant the two of you," Dent said. I looked at him then, the same steady look I'd given the two riders, not hostile, not a challenge, just looking at him while I thought about what I was going to say. 12 years, I said again. Something landed the way I'd meant it to. There are things you can say with 3 words if you say the right 3 words the right way. Dent found something he needed to do somewhere else and went and did it. Ida waited until the door closed behind him. Then she said very quietly, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Show up." "I've been coming to Fisher's for 12 years, the corner of her mouth. I heard you." Fisher was cleaning a jar and not listening to anything at all. "I'm not a person who needs protecting," she said. "I know that," I said. "Do you?" "You handled yourself all 3 times. I stopped, thought about what was actually true. I don't like seeing people made to feel small in public places, that's all." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How would you know how I was feeling?" "Same way you know how a horse is feeling before it does anything," I said. "You watch." She studied me, that long calibrating look she had like she was running numbers. "Buy me a cup of coffee," she said finally. "And explain to me why a man who could have his pick of women in this whole territory is spending his fall watching in general stores." We sat at the small table in the corner of the Caldwell Hotel's front room, which was the closest thing Dellard had to a public sitting place. Caldwell brought coffee and pretended not to pay any attention. He was the worst pretender in the county. He'd have been insulted to know how bad he was at it. She drank her coffee with both hands around the cup, even though the room was warm enough. I noticed it, the way it was less about warming and more about having something to hold, something between her and the air. "Where'd you come from?" I asked. "Kansas, before that Missouri." "Running from something or towards something?" She looked up. "Forward one, you don't ease into things, do you?" "Not when it's a waste of time." She set her cup down, picked it up again, looked at it. "Running from," she said, "not easily, the way you say a word that your mouth's been hurting around." "Does it matter what?" she said. "Not to me, none of my business." "Then why ask?" "So you'd know I was asking. It's better to say some things plainly instead of letting them sit sideways." She thought about that. Something shifted in her face, some minor interior negotiation I wasn't supposed to see. "My husband," she said, measured, like she was deciding, word by word, how much to put down. She was quiet for a moment, then she kept going. "Wasn't a kind man, wasn't a safe one. I left when I could, and I tried to go far enough that finding me by asking in the next town over wouldn't work. Whether I went far enough," she shook her head. "I don't know. I can't know until I know." A sound from the street outside. She tracked it with her eyes before she turned her head. That automatic quality, a person who's been listening for footsteps in the night for a long time. "Are you afraid he'll come here?" I asked. "I'm afraid of everything," she said, flat. Not self-pitying, she was well past the self-pity stage of it. Just a fact she was putting on the table the way you put down a tool you're done using. That's what happens after enough time. You can't turn it off. The watching and the waiting, even when there's nothing. It just runs. I sat with that for a moment. "Is he the kind who'd come after you?" I asked. He's the kind who'd think he had the right to, she said. Whether he'd act on it, she looked at her cup. I never could tell in advance with him. That was part of what made him what he was. I turned my coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, thought. You've got a week paid up, I said. What comes after? I haven't decided. What would you need to decide it? She looked at me with those old eyes. Why are you asking? Because you're careful and you've made it this far on your own. And if something about this place is making you think about moving on, I'd rather know what it is and whether it can be fixed than have you leave over something that didn't have to chase you away. She didn't answer right away. The room was quiet. Caldwell shuffled papers at his desk. She was looking at the window. At the street beyond it, the light going pale outside, afternoon wearing down. I've been through 4 towns in the last year, she said, trying to decide if a place was right, whether it felt possible. She picked up the cup, set it down again. I don't know how to explain what I'm looking for. I just know when something feels too exposed, too small, too close to where I came from. And this one, I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Fisher's wife was kind to me the first day, she said. Not in a way that was asking for anything, just kind. And the old man at the grain merchant, Sorrel, he saw me struggling with my bag on the stairs and he came and took it without asking, and then he handed it back and went inside. No comment. No expectation. She shook her head slightly. Small things, but after a while small things are what you have to go on. And me, I said, not pushing, honestly asking. She looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. Those eyes, something careful and something warmer behind the careful, like a light in a window at the back of a house. You scared me, she said. The first morning, a man stepping out like that, I thought for a second. She stopped. But then you said, I know, when I said I didn't ask for it, and that was the right thing to say. I waited. Most men say I was just trying to help, she said. That's the thing they say, like the point is their intention. You said, I know. I sat with that. I can sew, she said finally, moving on in the practical way she had. I'm good at it, not just mending, real work. Dresses, patterns, alterations that need actual skill. Before, a pause. Before I had a good business, I'd like to have one again. Fisher's wife takes in alterations, I said. She's always behind. She's been saying for 2 years she needs someone who can do the fine work so she can stop doing it herself. Ida looked at me long. You've thought about this? I've had a couple of weeks. She was quiet. I'll ask her in the morning, I said, if you want me to. She looked at her coffee, at the window, at her hands. Yes, she said, if you're willing. I asked Fisher's wife the next morning. She was interested before I'd finished the second sentence. Ida's situation, seamstress, good work, looking to stay on, was exactly what she'd been wanting for 2 years, and she had the characteristic Fisher's wife directness about it. The woman from the hotel, she said. Yes. Hands, she called toward the back. Fisher appeared in the doorway, with a look of someone interrupted during something that required concentration. You owe this man for 12 years of business, his wife said. I know it, said Fisher. Good, she turned back to me. Tell her Monday morning. We'll see what she can do and work out the arrangement. I went to the hotel, knocked on Ida's door. She answered with the door half open, the way someone answers when they've learned to answer, not because they're being unfriendly, but because half open is what you do when you can't be sure who's on the other side. I told her the arrangement, told her Fisher's wife wanted her Monday morning. She looked at me for a moment. You did this morning. Fisher's wife has been needing help for 2 years. It's good for her too. You went this morning first thing. I said I would. She was quiet, then, all right, yes, Monday. I turned to go. Wait, she said. I waited. Why? She asked. The same question as the first morning. She hadn't forgotten she'd asked it and hadn't gotten a full answer. I turned back. She was still in the half-open door, one hand on the frame. The hall window behind her put thin morning light along her shoulder and the side of her face. She looked tired in the deep way, the kind that comes from months of it, not nights. "I keep asking you that," she said, "and you keep not quite answering." "I answered it," I said. "You said you didn't like that kind of thing." "Still true." "That's not a reason for all of this." I thought about saying something tactful. Then I thought about who I was saying it to, and what tactful had probably meant in her life, and decided on the plain version. "You're a person worth taking trouble for," I said. "That's the whole of it." She looked at me. Her jaw moved, the small movement of someone who started to say something and then thought better of it. "Monday," she said. "Monday." The arrangement with Fisher's wife took hold fast. Ida was good at what she did, better than good. The first day Fisher's wife gave her a complicated dress alteration that 2 other women had declined, sleeves that needed resetting at the shoulder, a thing that sounds simple and isn't. And Ida sat down with it and had it done by afternoon, and done better than Fisher's wife had expected. Better than Fisher's wife herself would have done, probably, and Fisher's wife wasn't a woman who'd admit something like that easily, but she said it anyway. Word moved through Dellard the way word always moved through Dellard. By the end of the first week, 3 women had come in specifically asking if the new seamstress could look at a thing they'd been putting off having looked at. By the second week, Nell Fisher was talking to Ida about a formal arrangement, 2 afternoons a week at the counter in back, room to work. She moved out of the hotel at the end of that first week. Found a room above Sorrell's grain merchant on the south end, a small room, but with good light from the east window, its own outside staircase, and a landlord who was as benign as furniture and who seemed quietly pleased to have a tenant who paid 3 months in advance and kept a clean room. I watched all of this from the distance of my ranch and my work. I want to be precise about what I mean by that because it matters. I wasn't crowding her. Part of understanding what she needed was understanding what she didn't need, which was a man deciding he had a claim on her time and attention before she'd offered it. The way I kept it was simple. I came to town when I had genuine reason, spoke with her when we happened to be in the same place, didn't engineer meetings or manufacture reasons to be near her. But I was aware of her, aware the way you're aware of a thing you're responsible for, even if the responsibility was something I'd taken on without anyone assigning it to me. Aware of whether she seemed all right, aware of the trajectory, whether she was steadying or whether something was still pulling at her. Trout figured it out. He figured most things. It was his job, and he'd been doing it long enough that it was also his nature. One afternoon he came to stand alongside me at the rail where I was watching Ida talk to Nell Fisher in front of the general store. They were looking at a piece of fabric Ida was holding up. Something about the color or the weight of it. They were deciding something. Trout stood there a moment without saying anything and then said, without turning to look at me, "You planning on doing something about that or just watching the territory go by?" "Don't know yet what there is to do," I said. "She's steadying," he said. "You see it." "I see it." "Good sign or a bad one," he said, which wasn't a question. "Both," I said. He made a sound that was his version of understanding and went back to his office. He was right that it was both. The steadying was what I wanted. It was what she needed: roots, work, her own feet under her, this town knowing her face instead of looking at her like a newcomer. That was right and good. What it also meant was that she needed me less, and I knew what that meant for what I'd been telling myself about why I kept coming to town. I thought about that on the drive home more than once. There's something I should say about what the town made of it, of us, or whatever we were to each other in those months, because it's part of the picture. People in Dellard weren't stupid. They'd seen me come to town all those years. They knew my patterns, and they saw the patterns change. Fisher's wife, who noticed everything about everyone as a point of professional pride, had been watching since the first week. Caldwell had been watching since the first coffee. Sorrel, who had a room above his grain merchant and a view of comings and goings, had been watching since the beginning. None of them said anything directly, which was a mark of the particular tact that small towns sometimes manage and sometimes fail. What they did was close ranks around her in a quiet way, not dramatic about it. Just Nell Fisher made a point of introducing Ida around, mentioning her skills to women who had sewing they'd been putting off, saying her name where it needed to be said. Sorrel let her use the back entrance when the weather was bad without her asking. Caldwell once, when a man at the bar had said something about the seamstress on the South End in a way I didn't care for, said something to the man that I wasn't present for, but that resulted in the man paying for his drink and going out without finishing it. These were things I heard about later, not from the people who'd done them, from Paulo mostly, who had ears everywhere and no discretion about using them. I told him once that he gathered more information than was strictly necessary for a man hired to work cattle. "It's a small town," he said, with an equanimity that suggested he'd thought about it. "Everything's everybody's business. I'd rather know than not know." Which was fair enough. The point is this: the town had decided something about her before I decided anything out loud. They decided she belonged here, and they decided, separately or together, that whatever I was doing in her direction was the right kind of doing. I'd been here 12 years. They knew me. What they were saying in the quiet Dellard way of saying things was, "Yes, go on. This is the right thing." That was not nothing. In a territory where you build reputation slow and can lose it fast, that was a substantial thing. I felt the weight of it sometimes, not as pressure, as something warmer than that. I want to tell you about a night in late October. I'd come in after dark, which was unusual for me. I was generally home by nightfall and preferred it that way. But I'd had a horse with a bad shoe, and the Dellard blacksmith was the nearest, and by the time it was sorted and I'd seen to a few other things I'd put off, it was past 8 in the evening. The street was quiet. 2 men outside the saloon talking low. A dog nosing at the edge of the boardwalk. The kind of night that smelled like fall in a way that was different from summer's version, drier, cleaner, with a cold note underneath that said the easy part of the year was ending. I was heading to the livery to get my horse when I saw the light in the window above Sorrel's. Ida's window, yellow lamplight warm against the dark. The shadow of her moving behind the glass, slow and steady. The movement of somebody at work, sewing, probably the particular rhythm of it, leaning forward and back. I stopped in the street, stood there in the mud and the night air and looked up at that window. I don't have a clean word for what I felt. It was complicated and it was quiet and it wasn't entirely comfortable. Something about how much I wanted that lamp to keep burning, not for me, just for itself, just to mean she was warm and working and safe and nobody had come through the territory with her name in their mouth. Something about the plain gladness of her having landed here, in this unremarkable town, and things having worked out such that she had a place and a skill and 3 months paid to Sorrel. And something about the other thing, the harder thing, how long I was going to be content to be a person who stood in the street and looked at a window, whether content was even the right word for what I was doing. I got my horse, rode home, didn't sleep as well as usual. There was one afternoon in October, the 3rd week of the month, that I want to tell you about because it was the first time I understood something I'd been circling without looking at directly. I'd come in for a length of rope and some other small things, and I'd stopped by the assay office to see a man named Gale who had a question about the survey line on the north edge of my property. And by the time that conversation finished, it was past the middle of the afternoon, and I had time on my hands in the way that doesn't happen very often when you run a place alone. I went to Fisher's, bought what I'd come for. Stood at the counter for a moment after Fisher had rung me up, not quite ready to go back out to the wagon. Fisher was restocking a shelf behind him. He didn't turn around when he said, "She asked about you this morning." I didn't say anything. Just asked how long you'd been coming in, Fisher said. If you were known to be a decent sort. Whether you had people. He reached for another tin. I told her 12 years and yes and yes. He still hadn't turned around. I looked at the back of his head. Why are you telling me this? I said. Because you're standing at my counter not going anywhere, he said, and it seemed relevant. I went out. I sat in my wagon for a minute in the cold afternoon air. She had asked about me. That was a thing. Not a large thing. She'd been in a new town for 3 weeks. You asked about the people you kept running into. It was practical and it didn't mean anything beyond that. I knew this. I told it to myself clearly and started the horses. But all the way home, I thought about it. About the fact that she'd wanted to know something about me. About what question you ask when you ask how long a man's been coming to a place, and whether he's decent. You ask those questions when you're deciding if someone is safe. When you've been where she'd been, you're very careful about who you decide is safe. And she'd been careful enough to ask, and Fisher had said yes, and she'd filed that away somewhere. That was the thing I'd been circling. I'd been telling myself I was watching to make sure she was all right. That was true. But there was a second thing underneath it, quieter and harder to look at, which was that I wanted to be the kind of man she filed in the safe column. I wanted that to matter to her. I wanted to be the one she called safe. I got home, unhitched the horses, went inside and made supper, and didn't think about it anymore for the rest of the night. Or I tried not to. The second week of November, I had a bad stretch at the ranch. Not dangerous, nothing that couldn't be managed, but the kind of week that stacks up. The Northwell finally gave out on us completely on a Monday, and Crew and I spent 2 days digging and shoring and repairing it, and by Wednesday afternoon it was fixed, but we were both short-tempered and tired in the bones. Thursday, 3 steers got out through a section of fence we thought was all right and weren't, and Paulo and I spent half a day riding them down and the other half repairing fence in the cold. Friday it snowed, first real snow of the season, and the hay I'd been meaning to move into the dry storage got wet before I could get to it, and some portion of it was going to be loss, and I was going to have to do the arithmetic on that, and I didn't want to do the arithmetic on it. By Saturday I'd been going since before dawn every day for 6 days, and I was feeling my age in a way I didn't usually allow myself to feel it. My back, which had an opinion about cold and digging, was making its opinion known. I was sitting at the kitchen table Saturday evening with a cup of coffee I'd made and not drunk, and the look of the hay arithmetic on a piece of paper in front of me, and I was not in what you'd call a productive frame of mind. I came to town Sunday for the Fisher supper. I want to be honest, I almost didn't go. I was tired and I was short and I didn't feel like making the drive, and I thought about sending word that I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't quite the truth but wasn't far enough from it to be an outright lie. I sat with that thought for about 5 minutes and then I put on my coat and went, because I'd said I'd be there and that was that. I got there late, knocked. Nell Fisher let me in and took one look at my face and went and got me a glass of something from the back before I'd even gotten to the table. Fisher was already seated and nodded at me in the way he had that communicated. You look rough, no comment. Ida was in the kitchen doorway. She'd come early to help with the cooking. She looked at me when I came in, and I saw in her face the same thing Fisher's wife had registered, that assessment, quick and quiet. Then she went back to the kitchen without saying anything. We ate, good meal. Nell Fisher's cooking was always good. I was quieter than usual, which was saying something, and I let the conversation carry where it wanted to go without adding much to it. At some point Fisher started talking about a fellow who'd come through trying to sell him an excess supply of canned peaches at what Fisher considered an insufficient discount, and he was telling this story with the particular dry precision he brought to stories about commercial negotiations, and I watched Ida across the table starting to smile at it, a real smile. The kind that reached her eyes, and that helped. Whatever was heavy in me lifted a fraction. After supper Fisher and his wife went to do something in the kitchen. with the obvious quality of people who have found a reason to go elsewhere, and Ida and I were at the table with the remains of the meal. She looked at me. "Hard week," she said, not a question. "Yeah. The ranch. Well, went out some fence, lost some hay." I looked at the table. Nothing that can't be managed, just stacked up. She nodded, was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said, "about something I might be able to help with." I looked up. "There's a man who sells oilcloth at the market on Saturdays," she said. "Good quality. I use it for table covering sometimes. If you put it over the hay stack before the snow," she stopped. "You probably know that." "I know it," I said. "I just didn't get there in time." "I'm sorry," she said. "Not your fault," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm still sorry." She picked up her coffee cup. "You drove in when you could have stayed home." I said I'd come. She looked at me over the rim of the cup. "You're always doing what you said you'd do," she said, quiet, like she was noting something she'd been observing. "Seems like the basic requirement," I said. "You'd be surprised," she said, "how many men think it's optional." I thought about what to say to that and didn't say anything. "Thank you," she said, "for coming even when it was hard." It wasn't a large thing. It was just words. But there was something in the way she said it, the straight-on quality of it, the way she looked at me when she said it, that got through whatever tired armor I'd been wearing all week. The week felt lighter on the way home. I noticed that. It was Paulo who said it out loud, which I should have expected because Paulo was 23 and had not yet learned that some things are better left said internally. We were out on the north fence line on a cold November morning, the kind of work that takes the full attention of your hands and leaves your mind free to wander if you let it. And we'd been working in the good quiet for about an hour when Paulo said, without looking up from what he was doing, "You're different when you've been to town." "How so?" I said. "More settled, steadier in the evenings. Crew noticed it too." "Crew should concentrate on crew," I said. "He says that's what he is doing." I pulled a wire strand tight and twisted the end around the post. Paulo handed me the pliers without being asked, which I gave him credit for. "She's been through something bad," I said after a while, not answering what he'd said, just saying something true. "Yeah," Paulo said simply. "I figured." I stopped, started over. "I'm not pushing at anything. She needed to find her feet. She's finding them." "Okay," Paulo said, simple, didn't make a thing of it. We worked another stretch. The wind came up out of the northwest, cold smell of snow coming, a good working silence. At some point Paulo said, "You should tell her, though, whatever it is, before someone else gets the idea." "Nobody in Delart." He looked at me sideways, and in that look was more knowledge than I'd credited him with. "Dent's been in Fisher's 3 times this month," he said. "Crew told me." I thought about that. "You'd be surprised," Paulo said, and went back to the wire. He wasn't wrong. I knew Dent's type well enough. And I knew in the honest part of myself that I'd been keeping behind a door, that what I was doing, all this careful watching from a distance, wasn't going to hold forever. Not because she'd slipped back to being frightened, but because she was steadying up. Because she was becoming a woman who lived here, who had a place, who was known and respected, and who people smiled at on the street. That kind of woman gets noticed. And the person doing the noticing wasn't always going to be someone whose intentions were easy to read. I kept my own counsel through the rest of November, did my work, came to town when I had reason, spoke with her when we crossed paths, didn't push. December came in cold and hard. The pass east of town got its first real snow on the 3rd. The road from the south was still open, but not for long. I came in the first Friday of December to pick up some things I'd been putting off picking up, and I was heading across from the livery to Fisher's when Nell Fisher intercepted me before I'd gotten halfway. Her face had a particular quality to it that I recognized as, "Something has happened, and you need to know it." A man came in on Thursday's stage, she said. No preamble. He spent the morning asking about a woman matching Ida's description. Height, hair, the sewing. I know who he was asking about. The cold went from the air into somewhere behind my sternum. She know? I asked. I told her this morning. Where is she? Her room, Sorrel's with her. He said he wouldn't leave until someone came that she knew. A 65-year-old grain merchant sitting, watch outside a woman's door. I thought about that for 1 second and felt something towards Sorrel I'd have been embarrassed to name out loud. I sent for you first, Nell Fisher said. I know, I said, thank you. I went to Sorrel's, up the outside stairs. Knocked. Sorrel opened the door. He'd pulled a chair from somewhere and put it in the hall, which meant he'd been sitting outside her door, which I confirmed in my opinion of him as a man, and let me in. Ida was at her small table with her hands flat on it, not sewing, just sitting there with her hands pressed flat on the wood like she was keeping it from lifting. She looked up when she heard my step. He's here, she said. I know. He found me. Not panicking. That same flat, expensive evenness she'd used the day she told me about him. The kind of evenness that costs you. What's his name? I asked. Carver, Daniel Carver. Where's he staying? Caldwell's, Sorrel said from the doorway. Took a room last night. Trout went and spoke with him this morning. What Trout find? Carver says he's looking for his wife. Says she left owing him money. Says she took a horse. Sorrel's voice had a quality in it I'd heard before in men who decided they didn't like something. Trout asked to see any papers. No papers. Ida made a small sound. There wouldn't be. He doesn't leave papers. He's too careful for papers. Papers can be used against you, and he knows it. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, waited until she looked at me. What do you want to do? I said. She blinked, like the question was unexpected. Maybe it was. Maybe people in her life had made a habit of deciding what she was going to do without asking. I want him to go away, she said. I want to wake up tomorrow and have him be gone and have this town not know. She stopped, pressed her hands harder on the table. I don't want them to look at me differently. They won't, I said, but let's talk about getting him to go. She looked at me steadily, waiting. Option 1. You go to Trout. Not to make a legal complaint, there may not be grounds yet, but to tell him who Carver is and what he is. Trout can't arrest a man for asking questions, but he can watch. And being watched makes men like Carver uncomfortable, changes the arithmetic. If Carver tells people I took from him, then we deal with it when it happens. You've been here 2 months, people know you, that's worth more than you think. I paused. Option 2, I go talk to him. She looked sharp. To do what? To make him aware that you're not alone here, that there are people who know your name and are paying attention to what happens to you. Sometimes that's the whole conversation a man like that needs to have. Sometimes knowing that someone will notice changes the calculation enough. And if it doesn't change the calculation, then we think of the next thing. She looked at her hands, at the table, at me. You said we, she said quietly. I did. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not your problem, she said, and it wasn't sharp, not this time. It was almost sad, like she'd said it so many times she'd worn the edge off it. I know that, I said. You're a person I give a damn about, that's the distinction. The room held still. Sorrel was examining the windowsill with the concentration of a man reading a complicated document. Okay, she said, very small, both options. Both. Both, she said, Trout first, then you. I saw Trout first. He'd already formed his view, the mark of a man who'd been doing this long enough to read people quickly. He said he'd had a feeling about Carver when he'd spoken to him that morning. Said something about the careful way the man answered questions. Said he'd increase his presence on the south end of the street. He's staying long, you think? Trout asked. I'm going to suggest he doesn't, I said. Trute looked at me for a moment. You going over there? Yes. Keep it clean, he said. Not a warning, more like a preference stated for the record. Always do, I said. Caldwell's front room was empty except for Carver. He'd taken a table near the window, a man who liked to see the street, which told you something about how he operated. He was well-dressed in the way certain men are well-dressed, everything chosen and pressed, everything meant to say, I am a person of standing. He was maybe 50, careful face. The kind of face that had learned very early to show exactly what it meant to show, and nothing else. He saw me come in, and he calculated me in about 3 seconds. Men like him always did. I sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation, and set my hat on the table between us. I know who you are, he said. Good, I said, saves us some of it. You're going to tell me to leave. I'm going to tell you something simple, I said. Ida Voss came to this town 2 months ago. She has work here and people who know her and think well of her. The marshal knows her. I know her. People on this street know her face. You understand what I mean when I say people are paying attention to what happens to her. She's my wife, he said. She's a woman who left, I said. That's a different thing. Something moved in his face, a cold adjustment behind the eyes. You don't know her, he said. I know enough. She'll have told you things. His voice stayed level, confident, the voice of a man who's had a lot of practice being confident. Things that aren't quite true, she has a way of making herself look. I didn't ask you about that, I said. He was quiet for a moment. She owes me, he said. Write it down, I said. Sign it in front of the marshal, make a formal complaint, provide documentation of what she owes and how, and the legal process will handle it. If you can prove what you say you can prove, you'll have your remedy. If you can't, I let that sit. Then there's no legal business keeping you here. And a man who stays in a town without legal business and makes people uncomfortable tends to attract the wrong kind of attention from the law. He looked at me carefully, working something out. You her man, he said. I thought about that. I said, I'm a man who will know immediately if anything happens to her. He picked up his coffee cup, turned it, set it down. She put you up to this, he said. I decided to come here, I said. She didn't ask me to, that ought to tell you something. I picked up my hat, stood. Friday stage still runs this time of year, I said, before the pass closes. I walked out into the cold street. He was on the Friday stage. I want to be honest about this too. He didn't leave because he was afraid of me, not exactly. One man walking into a hotel room doesn't frighten a man like Carver, not when he spent a lifetime reading people and situations. What he did was calculate. He calculated that the woman he'd come after was not isolated, that she had a marshal who was watching and a man who was willing to sit down across from him and say clearly what the situation was, and that the legal avenue was closed because there were no papers and he'd known there were no papers. He calculated that whatever satisfaction he'd had in mind wasn't worth the cost of obtaining it in a place with this many eyes. He left because the numbers were wrong. That's enough, I'll take it. I stood in the street after he left and watched the stage until it cleared the South Bend and the dust had settled. Then I went and told Trute. He listened, nodded, said he'd keep an eye on the outbound road for a day or two anyway, which was the kind of thoroughness that had made him good at his job for 15 years. He also said, "You did that right," which from Trute was the equivalent of a lengthy compliment, and I received it accordingly. I went to Ida's room, knocked. She answered immediately. She'd been waiting, not pacing, just sitting at her table with her hands still and her eyes toward the door. "He's leaving Friday," I said. "Friday stayed." She went still for a moment, a different kind of still from all the other kinds I'd seen from her. Then she put her face in her hands. Not crying the way people mean when they say crying, just putting her face somewhere. taking a breath that was really several breaths stitched together. I sat down, let her have what she needed to have. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. 2 years, she said. I've been looking over my shoulder for 2 years. She shook her head. I don't know what to do with just like that. You wait and see if it's real, I said. That's all. Is it? I think so, yes. She nodded slowly. Her hands went back to the table. Then she looked at me, the full version of looking, not the careful, measured look she usually kept, and said, What do I owe you? Nothing. Her jaw tightened. Don't say nothing. I don't take without giving back. That's not who I am. Tell me what I owe you. You don't owe me anything, I said. I didn't do it for a debt. Then what did you do it for? I looked at her. I thought about Paulo's fence line comment, about Trude at the rail, about October standing in the street looking at a lamp in a window and the feeling of it and not having a word for the feeling. I want to tell you something, I said, and I want you to know before I say it that I'm not saying it to get anything from you. I'm not saying it because Carver leaving means something changed, or because I think you owe me something for today. I'm saying it because I've been not saying it for 2 months, and that seems long enough. She waited. I've been coming to town more than I needed to, I said, since the night the stage came in. You know that. I know, she said quietly. I've been watching to see that you were all right, trying not to crowd you, trying to give you the room to get your feet under you. I stopped. I don't know what to do with what I feel about you. I haven't known what to do with it for weeks, but I thought you should know it's there because you're a woman who deserves to know when a man has something he means honestly. She looked at me for a long time. Slow, she said finally. However slow you need. She looked at her hands. I'm not easy, Wheeze. I want to say that plainly. I'm slow to trust and slow to open, and I've got a history that doesn't go away just because he gets on a stage Friday. I don't know how long it takes to stop being the way he made me. You're not the way he made you, I said. You're the way you made you. That's why you're here. She looked at me. Something in her face shifted, some wall that had been in a certain position moving a fraction. Not a lot, enough to notice. Come to supper Sunday, she said. Nell Fisher's been teaching me her pot roast, and I need someone to tell me if I've learned it right. I'll be there, I said. I got up and put on my hat. Wheeze, she said. First time she'd used my name. Yeah, I said. I'm glad you were on that porch, she said, the night the stage came in. I stood there a moment, nodded, went down the stairs into the cold. That was the first week of December. He left on Friday. I watched the stage go from the end of the street, and I waited until it was fully gone, around the bend south of town, where the road curved through the low hills, before I went back to what I'd been doing. What I'd been doing was not much. I'd told Crew and Paulo I'd be in town through the end of the week, and they were capable men who didn't need me watching over their shoulder. So I stayed, not with any particular plan, just in case. Saturday, I repaired a bridle at the livery that had needed repairing for a month, and helped Fisher stack a delivery of lumber out back that would have been heavy going for one man alone, and ate supper at the saloon, because the saloon's cook on Saturdays made a decent beef stew, and I didn't feel like riding home and cooking in the dark. I had a beer, which I allowed myself occasionally on principle, and went to bed at the hotel at a reasonable hour and lay awake for longer than usual. The hotel ceiling had a water stain in the northwest corner that someone had tried to paint over, and the paint had cracked, and now it looked like a bare tree in winter. I looked at it for a while, thought about Carver, wherever he was sleeping across the hall or 2 doors down, calculating whether to stay or go. Thought about how small the difference was, sometimes, between a man who did the right thing and a man who didn't, that small space where the numbers either worked or they didn't, where a man either had enough rope on him or didn't. Thought about Ida with her face in her hands. Thought about Nell Fisher's Bred in December. About a bay horse settling in the dark. About the particular way she said my name now versus how she hadn't said it at all in October. I wasn't worried exactly. I was awake. There's a difference. Worry is when you don't know the outcome. Being awake is when you know the outcome is right but you're still watching over it until it's done. The stage left at 8 in the morning. I'd hear the horses, I'd know. Sunday morning, I was coming out of the hotel, just past 8, when I almost walked into Ida coming up the steps. She stopped, I stopped. She had her shawl pulled tight and a basket on her arm, and she'd been up early enough that her cheeks had some cold color in them. She looked at me with a particular expression, not quite startled, something more deliberate than startled, like she'd been thinking about something and walking toward it. I was going to knock, she said. I was just coming down, I said. We stood there on the steps for a moment. Nell Fisher made cinnamon bread, she said. I thought, she stopped, held up the basket slightly. I thought you might be hungry. I looked at her. She was looking at the basket. Come inside, I said. It's cold. We sat at the same small table in the corner where we'd had coffee the first time. Caldwell brought coffee without being asked. He'd learned the habit of us. Ida unpacked the basket, the bread, wrapped in cloth, still warm, and 2 of Nell Fisher's late-season apples, and a small jar of honey that Ida had apparently contributed herself. We ate the bread. It was good. We talked about small things, whether the weather would hold through the end of the month, what Sorrel had said about a leak in the roof above the staircase that he was trying to decide whether to fix before or after the hard cold, whether Ida had managed to get any sleep this week with everything going on. Better than I expected, she said. Yeah. I kept thinking I'd hear something at the door, she said. His step, the way he knocked. She shook her head. But I didn't. I just heard the grain merchant's dog and someone's wagon and the ordinary sounds. She looked at her coffee. It sounds foolish. It doesn't, I said. I'm going to hear those sounds for a while, she said. The not there ones. The ones I'm listening for and they don't come. I know, I said. She looked at me. Do you? I know what it is to listen for something that's gone, I said. The shape of a voice in a house that's quiet. The habit of expecting it. She studied me. Who, she said, and then, only if you want to tell me. I turned the bread cloth between my fingers. A woman named Clara, I said. 19 years ago it'll be, come March. We were good together. She got sick in October and was gone by March. I spent a long time after that listening for things that weren't there. Ida was very still. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago, I said, but it's the kind of thing that stays in the body, the listening habit. She nodded. She understood that. Eventually, I said, you stop listening for that particular thing. You start listening for other things instead. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across the small table and touched the back of my hand, very briefly, just the tips of her fingers, the way she'd done after the first coffee, the first real conversation. The same small, deliberate gesture. Thank you for that, she said. For what? For telling me something true about yourself. She pulled her hand back, picked up her coffee. People don't always do that. We finished the bread and the coffee. Caldwell refilled the cups without being asked, still doing his excellent impression of a man who was not paying any attention. When we went out to the street, the cold had sharpened overnight, and the sky was the flat gray that meant more snow before the end of the week. She pulled her shawl up, and I stood there in the cold, not quite ready to say goodbye. Drive out sometime, I said. When the weather's good, I'd like to show you the place. She looked at me a beat. All right, she said. Not yet, but all right. What came after was slow, as she'd said it would be, and I want to do it justice because the slow was real, and it was right, and trying to rush past it to get to the easier parts would be a dishonesty. Sunday supper at the Fishers, was exactly what it sounded like if four people at a table, good food, Fisher, eating with the serious attention of a man who takes this kind of thing seriously. Nell Fisher drawing Ida out with questions about her work and her life, Ida talking more freely than I'd heard her talk before. The pot roast was good. She'd learned it right. I said so. She received the compliment with a small cautious look like she was checking to see if there was something behind it, and then, finding nothing, accepted it. I walked her to the foot of the stairs at Sorrel's after. She said good night, I said it back. That was all. The second Sunday the weather had cleared after a week of cold, and after supper we walked to the end of the main street and back in the dark, talking about things I couldn't always reconstruct later, her life before Kansas, what she'd wanted when she was young, before wanting had become a risky occupation, what my spread looked like in spring, whether I thought Dellard was the kind of place that stayed small or the kind that grew into something else. She had opinions about things. Careful opinions, tested and arrived at through her own process, not performed for the sake of having something to say. I liked that about her. I liked it the way you like something you didn't know you were waiting for until you find it. Third Sunday I noticed she looked at me differently when I came to the door. Not dramatically, a small thing, a quality of having thought about something in the way she held her eyes when she saw me come up the walk. I noticed it and said nothing. Let it be what it was. By the new year she'd stopped tracking sudden sounds the way she had those first weeks. Not completely. There were still moments when something made a noise she wasn't expecting, and I'd see the old reflex flicker up and then get set aside. But the resting version of her wasn't listening for footsteps anymore. That was a thing. I knew what it meant. The distance between her and the fear she'd come here with was growing. She was building herself something solid, work, a name in the town, small dignities of her own. She was becoming a woman who lived in a place rather than a woman who was hiding in one. That was the best thing, and I was glad of it. And it also meant what it meant, which was that what I'd offered her in that month, my presence at the edges, a body that stood between her and the thing that scared her, was becoming less necessary. Which was right, which was what I'd wanted, and which, in the small hours, was a thing I thought about with a kind of ache I hadn't expected to have. She came out to the ranch the third Sunday of January. It was one of those winter days that tricks you, cold but bright. Sky so blue it didn't seem possible for the time of year. The snow from the last storm crusted over so it caught the light and threw it back. She rode out with me after Fisher's supper, on a horse she'd borrowed from the livery, a calm bay who'd been around enough Januaries to have no opinions about the cold. She rode well, not showy, just practical, the way a woman who'd grown up somewhere with horses rides. The ranch looked clean in winter, everything spare. The trees were bare and you could see the whole shape of the land in a way you couldn't in summer when the grass was tall. The creek had frozen at the edges but ran dark in the middle. The barn sat solid against the hill to the north. She looked at it all the way in. Crew was already gone for the day. He had a small cabin on the south edge of the property. Paulo had gone into town for the evening, which I hadn't arranged and hadn't needed to. I put up both horses and we went inside. The house was warm. I'd left the fire banked before going to town. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it. The long table I'd built the fourth year I was here, good planks, wide enough to work on or eat on. The shelves of books along the east wall, which was a thing some people found surprising about me, and which Ida did not seem to find surprising at all. The rack of tools by the back door. The rug in front of the fireplace. "It feels like you," she said. "Good or bad?" "Good, solid, practical, but not cold. Some practical places are cold, this one isn't." I made coffee and she sat at the table and we talked, different from the conversations in town. Something about being inside the house made the talking different, easier, more room in it. She asked about the books, which ones I'd read first, which I'd had to work to get through, which ones I kept coming back to. She had her own opinions, careful and arrived at through her own process. We argued mildly about a novel we'd both read, mildly meaning she told me plainly I was wrong and made the case, and I thought about it and said she was right, and she accepted that without any gloating, which I respected. The coffee ran out and I made more. Going on 8 o'clock, there was a sound from the barn. I went to check, and she came with me. The borrowed bay had gotten himself turned around in the stall in an uncomfortable way and was working himself toward agitation. I went in and talked him down with the low voice you use with horses in the dark. He settled, and got him straight and put fresh water in the bucket. When I turned around, Ida was in the doorway watching. "You're good with them," she said. "You spend enough time." "No," she said. "Some men spend plenty of time and the horses never settle for them. It's not the time." I brushed hay off my coat. He just needed someone to tell him it was all right. She looked at me with those eyes. "Most things do," she said quietly. We walked back to the house across the crusted snow. The night was clear and cold, stars out in number, our boots crunching, the lamp still burning in the window ahead. At the door she stopped and looked up at the sky for a moment. I stopped beside her. "It's very quiet here," she said. "Most nights." "I mean it is good. I'd forgotten what that felt like, quiet that's safe, not quiet that's waiting to become something else." I didn't say anything. "I'd like to come back," she said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," I said. She nodded once, went in. I stood outside a minute longer, looking at the stars, before I followed her in. February brought a cold snap that turned the main street of Dellard into something like pale glass. I was coming out of Fisher's on the morning of the 3rd, supplies stacked in the wagon, and Ida came out of the space she'd taken over on the ground floor of the old tailor's building. She'd outgrown the counter at Fisher's by January, had enough regular work that it made sense to have her own place, and Nell Fisher had helped her arrange it. She had a key and a sign in the window. That was something. She stepped off the boardwalk onto the street, and the ice took her feet out from under her. I was across the street and I was moving before I'd decided to move, which is how those things work, and I got to her in time. Both hands on her arms, her weight against me for a second, her hand gripping my coat sleeve hard. We stood there like that for a moment, neither of us quite moving, her against my chest and both of us still. She looked up. I looked down. Her eyes at that distance, the cold air between us, some charge in it that I didn't name. "Thank you," she said, careful with the words. "Any time," I said, the same care. She straightened up and didn't quite let go of my arm right away, and we walked to the dry boards that way, her hand through my elbow, both of us watching the ice, both of us very aware of the other. And when the footing was good again, she let go, and neither of us said anything about it, and I thought about it the whole drive home and for about 3 days after. There are things you work out in your head and things you work out in your hands, and I've always been the second kind of man. Problems I've tried to think through in the abstract go in circles. Problems I've taken outside with me, carried while I was doing something else, those tend to sort themselves. The last 2 weeks of February, I spent a lot of time outside. We had a stretch of work that needed doing on the south fence line, not urgent, not broken, just deteriorating in the way things deteriorate if you let them go one more winter, and I took it on myself rather than giving it to Crew or Paulo, because I wanted the rhythm of it. Out there in the cold in the mornings, the ground still frozen underfoot, the work steady and physical. Pulling staples, resetting posts, stringing new wire in places, twisting it tight with the fencing pliers until my hands ached. Crew came out with me the first 2 days and then seemed to understand, the way Crew understood things, that this was a one-man job and when to do something else. What I was working out was simple, and it was also not simple at all. I had the ranch, had 12 years of building it, and I knew what it was, a good place, a real operation, something I'd be glad of until the end of my life. I had Crew and Paulo, and the knowledge that the work I'd put in was going to keep paying back as long as I kept at it. I'd had a life here, and it was a decent life, and I'd come to terms with it being the kind of life you live alone. And now there was Ida. I strung wire and thought about the kind of life I'd been living and the kind I might be living instead. Not in a wishing way, I was past the age where wishing felt useful, just looking at it honestly. The ranch was built for more than one person. That wasn't a thing I'd thought about much in recent years, but now I thought about it. The west porch in the evenings, the size of the table, the extra bedroom I'd finished 2 years back and used for storage. These were things I'd built without acknowledging what I was building toward, the way you sometimes do things you understand only later. I thought about the particular quiet of the house in the evenings. I'd never minded it. It was part of the life. But now when I came inside at the end of the day, the quiet had a different quality to it, not oppressive, not lonely exactly, but aware, like it knew what it was missing in a way it hadn't known before. I didn't let myself go much further than that out on the fence line. You do too much thinking about something you want and it turns into a kind of pressure, and pressure was the last thing she needed from anyone ever again. But I pulled the wire tight, and I knew what I knew. She came out to the ranch again the second Sunday of February, on a better day weather-wise, and this time she brought a pie she'd baked at the Fishers, wrapped in cloth, and set it on the table and said she'd wanted to practice the crust and needed someone to tell her honestly how she'd done. The crust was good. I told her so, and she didn't do the cautious thing this time. She nodded once, matter of fact, like she'd thought it probably was and was just confirming. We sat in the kitchen and ate pie and drank coffee, and the afternoon went somewhere I hadn't entirely noticed it was going. And at some point it was past 4 and the light was going, and she said she should get back before dark. I walked her out to the horse. She stood there with her hand on the pommel for a moment, looking at the barn, the pasture, the sky going pink in the west. "I like it here," she said. "Good," I said. "I like how it sits," she said. "The way the hill is on the north side and the open ground to the south. Smart placement." "Took me 2 weeks walking the land before I built anything," I said. She looked at me sideways. "You think about things long before you do them." "Usually." "Not always." I thought about the morning on the street when I'd walked across to the 2 men without deliberating about it. "Not when there's no time," I said. She nodded. Something in her face was easy, more relaxed than I was used to seeing, not the managed easy of someone performing ease, but the actual kind, the kind you can't fake. She swung up into the saddle, gathered the reins, looked down at me. "Thank you for the afternoon," she said. "Thank you for the pie," I said. "Any time," she said, with just the lightest emphasis on the word, the same word I'd said to her in February, on the ice, after she'd thanked me for catching her. Just barely enough emphasis to know she'd meant it, not enough to make anything of it. She turned the horse and rode out. I watched until she was around the bend in the track, going south toward the road. Then I went back inside. Crew was in the kitchen getting his hat when I came in. He looked at me, looked at the 2 coffee cups on the table, looked at me again. "She's a good woman," he said. It was about the longest opinion he'd ever offered unprompted on any subject. "I know," I said. He picked up his hat and left. March came in the way March always came in that territory, arguing with itself. A warm day and then 2 cold ones, and then a week of mud so thick it pulled at your boots with every step. And then one morning, sometime in the 3rd week of the month, I stepped outside before sunup and the smell of the air had changed, and I knew it the way you always know it. Winter's done. The hard part is over. Whatever comes next, it comes in warmth. I'd been turning something over for a while. A month, maybe longer. Not what I felt, I knew what I felt, had known it with increasing clarity since about October, maybe since earlier than October if I was willing to be honest. What I'd been turning over was whether there was a right time to say more than I'd said, and whether the right time was something I'd know when I got to it. Paulo, shoveling mud out of the barn doorway on a warm Tuesday. You look like a man who's thought something through and is about to do something about it. Mind your shovel, I said. Yes, sir, he said, grinning at the mud. Ida had been in her own shop 3 months by then. Had a girl who helped her 3 mornings a week. Had a second girl who came in for heavy fabric work on Fridays. Had a backlog of orders going into April. She'd bought a better table and 2 good lamps and had put up a curtain in the window that she'd made herself from fabric she'd dyed, a deep blue that people on the street sometimes stopped to look at. She had a life here. That was plain, and it was real, and it was hers. I came in on a Thursday afternoon, bread day, Nell Fisher's bread, and went by the shop. The door was open for the spring air. She was alone, the girls gone for the day, working at the table with the good lamps and the deep blue curtain. She looked up when I came in and said my name the way she said it now, easy, like it was a word she'd had a long time and was comfortable with. I came in, set my hat on the chair inside the door. I want to show you something, I said, if you've got an hour. She looked at me, that considering look. Then she set down her work and untied her apron. I drove her out to the ranch. Not the formal way, it was a work wagon and the road was still half mud, and I'd have been embarrassed about it except that she didn't seem bothered. She sat on the bench beside me with the same practicality she brought to everything and watched the territory go by. We talked some. Didn't talk some. The comfortable quiet had been there between us for a long time now, the kind that grows up between people when they've been around each other enough that silence doesn't need to be filled. The ranch looked different in early spring than it did in the fall. Greener, the cottonwoods showing their first leaf, the creek running high from the snowmelt, the grass in the east pasture coming in wet and bright. Crew was somewhere on the far side of the south fence. Paulo was nowhere visible, which probably meant he was doing something useful and not showing off about it, which was a mark of the year he'd put in. I pulled up in front of the house and stopped. She looked at it. The house was solid. I'd built it myself the second year I was here when I knew I was staying and wanted to stay right. Stone foundation, good timber, wide plank floors, 2 porches east and west, so you had shade no matter the hour. Improved it every year since. A root cellar, a spring house, a barn that didn't let in the wind. 12 years of work in it. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for my hand, walked up to the east porch and stood there looking at the pasture. You love this place, she said. I do. You built it yourself. Crew helped. I built most of it. She was quiet for a moment. The spring air moved through the cottonwoods, made a sound like water. Why did you bring me here? She said. I came up to stand alongside her, looking at the same view. The creek, the pasture, the sky going wide and blue to the west. I wanted you to see it, I said. The whole thing, before I said anything else. Because whatever I say next is attached to this place, to this life, and I thought you should be standing in it when I said it. She turned to look at me, steady, waiting. I'm not asking you for anything, I said. I want to say that first. I know where you are and I know that slow has been right and I'm not changing that. But I've been not saying something for a long time, and I think not saying it anymore is more honest than keeping it in. I looked out at the pasture, at the 12 years of it. I love you, I said. That's all. Not as a demand or a debt or a reason for anything. I just wanted you to know it's there so you're not navigating around something that's invisible. The cottonwoods moved in the wind. She looked at the view. She looked at it for a long time and I let her, because this was not a moment to hurry. Slow, she said finally. Still slow, I said. I keep saying that and you keep saying you understand and you do understand. She shook her head slightly. That's not a thing I was used to. I've got time, I said. The ranch isn't going anywhere. She was quiet. The creek made its sound below us. I know what I feel, she said then, and something in her voice was different, not the careful, measured thing. I've known for a while what I feel. It was never the feeling I was slow about. She paused. It was the trusting it, trusting that what I felt was real and that what you were doing was real and not. She stopped, looked down at the porch railing, back at the pasture. Not something he'd trained me to expect and then pull away, she said quietly. I didn't say anything. That deserved a moment. But you've been the same, she said. Since the first morning, you've been the same every single time, steady. She turned and looked at me fully. I've never had steady before. I didn't know what it looked like. It doesn't look like much from the outside, I said. It looks like everything from the inside. She shook her head again like she was disagreeing with herself about something. I love you, she said. I have loved you for a while and I've been, the corner of her mouth. A real one this time, not a courtesy toward one. I've been waiting to be sure I was allowed. Something opened in my chest, the specific feeling of a door you didn't know was closed. I reached out slow, deliberate, so she could see it coming, and she reached toward me at the same time, and her hand was in mine, warm, steady. We stood there like that and looked at the pasture together, and after a while she leaned against my shoulder, just slightly, just resting there, and I put my arm around her and she let herself lean, and we didn't talk for a while. The light went gold across the grass. The cottonwoods threw long shadows east. The creek kept on. She said eventually, very quietly, "It's a good place." "Gets better," I said, "every year." She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, settled against my side a little more. I'm going to tell you the rest of it the way it happened, which was not all at once and not without difficulty, because I said I'd be honest, and this is the honest version. There were still nights, she told me much later, after we were married and she could say it, when she'd wake up listening, the old reflex running before she was awake enough to stop it. Months of that, on and off. The sounds of a new place that her body hadn't learned to trust yet. There were times in the spring when something would catch her off guard, and I'd see the ghost of what she'd been, that brace, that going still, before she shook it off. She was building something new in herself, and new things take time and you can't hurry them. We kept the slow. Sunday suppers, sometimes at the Fishers. Sometimes I cooked at the ranch and she came out. She'd gotten her own horse by April, a sound little brown mare from a rancher west of town, and she rode her well. Conversations that went long in the evenings. Silences that were comfortable. The occasional night when something was too much for her, and she went quiet in a way that meant she needed to be alone with it, and I learned to feel when that was happening and give her the space without making it a thing. There was one evening in late March I want to tell you about because it was the one that moved something in me I hadn't known was still movable. She'd come out to the ranch on a Sunday and we'd had supper at the table. I'd made a pot of stew, a simple thing, and she'd brought biscuits. And afterward we were sitting on the east porch in the last of the light. Not talking, just sitting. She had her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and she was looking at the pasture where the first green of spring was starting to come in, pale and uncertain, the way new things look before they're sure. I was looking at the same view, or mostly, now and then looking at her looking at it. At some point she said, without turning, "What does it feel like, owning something like this?" I thought about it, like being responsible for something that matters. Does it feel heavy? Sometimes, mostly it feels right. She nodded, her eyes stayed on the pasture. I never owned anything, she said. Nothing that was actually mine, things I had turned out to be his. The dress shop I ran, she paused. He owned the building. Turned out that meant he owned everything in it, in the way he saw the world. I didn't say anything. I've been thinking about what it would mean to own something, she said. Really own it, my name on the deed, my sign on the door. She turned to look at me then. That's what the shop is. First time I've had that. How does it feel? I asked. The corner of her mouth. Like being responsible for something that matters, she said. I looked at her, she looked at me. The moment held itself still. Then she turned back to the pasture, and we finished our coffee and the light went out of the sky, and we sat there in the comfortable dark listening to the creek and the horses and the sounds a working ranch makes when it's settling into night. I drove her back to town later. At the foot of Sorrel's stairs, she said good night, and then stopped on the first step and looked back. "Wheeze," she said, I just want you to know I see what you're doing." "What am I doing?" I said. "Being patient," she said, "on purpose, every single time." Her voice was steady, but there was something behind it. "I know what that costs. I know it's not easy. I want you to know I see it." She went up the stairs. I stood there for a minute in the dark. Got in the wagon, drove home, sat at my table for a while before I went to bed. She saw it. She'd been watching the way I'd been watching, careful and quiet, taking account. She saw it and she'd named it out loud, and that was one of the most uncomplicatedly good things anyone had ever said to me. I slept well that night. April came in warm and smelling like the end of something, winter done and done this time, no more arguing. She was out at the ranch most Sundays now. Had her own pattern of it. Arrive in the afternoon, help if I was in the middle of something, sit and talk if I wasn't, eat supper at the table together, stay until the light was mostly gone. She'd started leaving small things. Not deliberately, or not all of them deliberately. A shawl she'd set down on the porch chair and forgotten. A book she'd brought to read on the drive and left on the shelf. One afternoon I found a pin cushion on the windowsill in the kitchen, the small red kind that looks like a tomato, and I didn't move it. Crew noticed the pin cushion. I know because he spent an unusual amount of time looking at the windowsill one morning, and then went outside without saying anything. The third Sunday of April, she got out to the ranch before I'd finished what I'd been doing in the north pasture, and when I came in, I found her in the kitchen. She'd started the fire. She'd learned where I kept the wood, and she had water on and was looking through my provisions with the focused expression of someone who's decided to cook something. "I don't need," I started. "I know you don't need," she said without turning around. "I want to." I washed my hands, sat at the table, watched her move around my kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who's been paying attention to how a space works. She made a simple supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread, nothing complicated, but she'd seasoned the beans right, and the cornbread was better than what I made for myself. We ate at the table with the evening light coming in from the west window. Halfway through supper she said, without looking up from her plate, "I've been thinking about the west bedroom." I looked at her. "The one you use for storage," she said. "Good light in there, south-facing window." She picked up her fork. "I've been thinking it would make a good workroom, for the fine work, the things that need natural light." I was still. "If," she said, and then she stopped, looked up, met my eyes. "If," I said. "If the person who owns the storage in that room was willing to find another place for it," she said. The word "if" sat between us on the table. We both knew what it was holding. I proposed in late April. We were on the east porch of the ranch. It had become, without anyone deciding it, the place we spent time when she came out, and the evening light was the particular color it gets in late April, that warm copper going into blue, and I said what I meant to say, which was not a long speech. Just, "I want to marry you. I want this to be yours as much as it's mine. I want to know you for the rest of whatever time I get." She didn't answer right away. Then she said yes. Not small, not tentative. Yes, full-voiced, like she'd decided she was done being tentative about things she meant. We married in June. Not in the church. Neither of us was in a mood to wait for the right third Sunday, and the preacher who came through wasn't a man I'd have chosen for this particular occasion anyway. Trout was a justice of the peace alongside being a marshal, which I'd known and she hadn't, and when I told her she laughed, the real laugh, the one I'd first heard from the doorway of her shop that afternoon in March. I came into town the morning of the wedding and stopped by Fisher's first, because I'd promised to help move a delivery of sacks to the back storage that Fisher was expecting, and I intended to keep the promise even on this particular morning. Fisher looked at me when I came in with an expression that in 12 years I'd learned to read as, "You have your priorities slightly wrong, but I appreciate the consistency." "Go," he said, "I'll get Sorrel. It'll take 5 minutes." "Wheeze," he said, "go." I went across to the hotel. Caldwell, behind his desk, looked up and then looked at his watch and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has watched a great deal of human life pass through his front room and has opinions about timing. "She's been ready since 7, he said. "It's barely 9, I said. "I know," he said. I went up the stairs. Knocked on Ida's door. She'd stayed the night at the hotel so we could arrive to town the same morning from different directions, which was her idea and which I'd understood as meaningful to her, having the beginning be something that happened in the ordinary way. She opened the door and she was in a dress I hadn't seen before, dark blue, good fabric, fitted right, and her hair done carefully. Not elaborate, just careful. I stood there in the doorway. She looked at me. "You look like you've seen something surprising," she said. "No," I said, "just you look well." She looked down at the dress. "I made it," she said. "I know," I said, "I can tell." Something moved on her face. Not the small, cautious, almost smile, the old one. A different thing, fuller and warmer, that looked like it had been waiting for a while to have room to show up. "All right," she said, "let's go get married." We married in Fisher's front room on a Wednesday afternoon. Fisher and Nell. Sorrel in his good coat, which he'd brought out from Pennsylvania in some earlier part of his life and kept for occasions worth keeping it for. Crew standing in the back with his hat in his hands, the way he stood at every occasion, serious and present and saying nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. Paulo, who'd cleaned up to a degree I hadn't known was possible, and who was trying very hard not to look as moved as he was, and not entirely succeeding. Trute read us the words. He had the particular quality of a man who's done something enough times that he knows it matters and doesn't rush it and doesn't perform it. When he got to the part about having and holding, he looked at Ida and then at me, one and then the other, and what was in his face was exactly the right thing and he knew it. We said what we were meant to say. Ida's voice was steady and level and clear, the way her voice was when she meant something completely. Afterward Nell Fisher did cry, and would have denied it if you'd pressed her, and Fisher handed her his handkerchief with the practical affection of a man who loves his wife well and has the handkerchief ready. Fisher made a toast in German. Nobody fully understood it, but it sounded like something you'd want said about you. Trute shook my hand, then he looked at Ida and said, "You did all right for yourself," which from Trute in a formal setting was a speech. Paulo shook my hand with both of his, hard, for a long time, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has watched something happen that he'd known was coming, and was glad to have been right. Crew last put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, didn't shake, just put it there, and looked at me with eyes that said 12 years of things that neither of us would have said out loud, and then he nodded once and put his hat back on. Nell Fisher had made bread. We rode back to the ranch in the evening, Ida on the brown mare and me on the gray, the light going long and gold across the territory. The road was dry for once, and the air was warm and carried the smell of the grass coming in right. She pulled even with me somewhere south of the creek crossing. We rode side by side without talking, the horses easy, the territory going quiet around us. The light was that particular gold that happens in June in that part of the country, deep and warm, everything it touched going slightly luminous. She was looking at the horizon, at ease, the kind of ease I could see it even from the side that was different from any ease I'd seen on her before. Not the careful kind, not the managed kind. The kind where you've put something down and you know it's down for good. She caught me looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. She looked at me sideways, that corner of her mouth. "Thank you," she said after a while. For what? I said. For not deciding who I was supposed to be, she said. She thought about it. For just watching and waiting and letting me be what I was until I could be something else. I didn't have anything to say to that wasn't smaller than the thing she'd said. We rode on. The ranch came up out of the evening dark ahead of us, the lamp we'd left burning in the window showing first, small, steady, visible from a long way off. The kind of light that means someone has been there and will be there, and the door is not locked. The horses knew the road home. We let them have it. Side by side in the warm evening, the territory wide and quiet around us, the light burning ahead to show us in. That's what I remember, that lamp. The way it held in the dark, the way she rode easy, her hair loose in the wind. The way some things, after long enough, hold.